We're good there.
Yes, that's a sweet,
Fantastic.
sweet robot voice right there. Lisa Schaefer's here too. Hi, Lisa.
Well, thank you to the Suicide Prevention Network and LTCC and all the other folks who put in the time and effort to come join today. I'm going to be presenting on self-harm. I've got a little PowerPoint set up here. So what I'm going to do is figure out how to share my screen. And then hopefully we'll jump in here. Can everybody see that? I see thumbs up. All right, fantastic. So my hope in this presentation tonight is not just to talk at folks. Please, please, please chime in, ask questions, challenge me on things too. I love conversations with folks during these presentations, and I do too much talking throughout the day as it is. So hearing myself talk even more at the end of the day here, you'd actually be doing me a favor if you chimed in. So I welcome anything. I don't quite know how to figure out if somebody has a question. So if you just interrupt me by unmuting your mic, that's perfectly fine. Let me get going here. So we're going to do a brief overview of what self-harm is, what self-harm is not. We're going to talk about pain and self-harm. And one of the interesting things I thought we could cover tonight as a little bit of a sub-focus is how the internet is really kind of shaping what self-harm looks like and where folks are influenced in a variety of ways. And I hope to also spend the bulk of our time kind of at the end there in terms of how to help. I got a section for questions and answers. And if there are no questions and answers, I have a surprise for everybody. Anyone want to guess what that part's about? So we're going to talk about self-harm. Oh, I skipped a slide here. Who I am. I go by Dr. Matt or Matt, either is fine. I am a psychologist here in town. I am not your psychologist, however. And I say that actually to kind of frame a little bit of how I'm going to be talking about this. Many folks may have their own personal experience, their own community experience of self-harm. And what I'm going to be doing primarily, since I'm a psychologist and not your psychologist, is talking very broadly. If you have a specific question about your life or the life of somebody that you know, I probably am not going to be able to answer it. This wouldn't quite be the right format for it, since we are A, recording this, and I don't know exactly where that's going to go, but B, they can be pretty delicate conversations, and I want to make sure that everybody feels comfortable with this topic as much as we can. I am available offline, of course, if you want to have a further conversation. So everyone kind of clear about that? Any questions on that piece? Okay. Pretty straightforward. So let me jump right into self-harm here. When I say the phrase self-harm, what do people generally think of? And I gave you a little bit of a cheat sheet here. So anyone want to be brave and kind of chime in to say how they think of self-harm or what it means to them? I'll take the answers away. How about that?
Well, now you made it harder. It's my understanding is cutting or burning or like picking at your skin, things like that do harm to yourself based on some emotional trauma or things that are causing that.
Yeah, it's really quite broad in its definition. It is essentially doing any kind of a behavior to harm yourself. And Amber, thank you for speaking up there. Oftentimes it does involve cutting, burning, hair pulling, hitting. Some folks use electricity, interestingly enough. There are just so many different forms of it. And I want to kind of keep coming back to this idea that it's more of a behavior, but it does tend to signal some pretty important things. The way that we mental health people think about it is essentially it's a way of expressing difficulty in life, but it's actually for many folks a coping mechanism. It's not an ideal coping mechanism, of course, but it is a way that some people, a behavior that some people use to kind of regulate or modulate their feelings, sometimes to numb out, sometimes to distract, sometimes to just kind of get through a tough period. And the interesting thing is that a lot of people report relief after they engage in some form of self-harm. And the research on this phenomenon is actually pretty interesting. The research has looked pretty consistently at cutting as one of the primary behaviors because it tends to be what happens most often. For some folks, and this is not everybody, but for some folks, it actually gives them the same feeling that you get if you go for a hard workout. It kind of gives you that runner's high because what's happening in your brain is it's actually releasing endorphins and some natural opioids. So for many people, it is actually a way that they get relief. It's not just them feeling relief, it's their brain flooding their system with some relief types of hormones. Anyone had that kind of runner's high, or just after a hard workout, you really kind of feel euphoric and kind of like you're floating a little bit?
All the time. That's why I work out and run as much as I do. I think it's awesome. I'm like, wow.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
And,
yeah.
Shauna, to your point about that, some folks do feel very enthusiastic about the self-harm that they get involved in. And so what I'd like to propose to you is that we treat it with a little bit of delicacy, that it's not something we should instantly say is bad, wrong, and you should never do, but instead to look at it in terms of its function and say, okay, maybe there's an opportunity to hear something important about a person's experience through this behavior and also guide them to something that probably is going to be a little bit better long-term solution for them. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? Oh, good. I see more people coming. I'm just going to admit them as they come. We don't have anybody on their like band list or anything, do we, Shauna?
No. So far, it looks like just folks from LTCC for the most part. So yay, thanks for joining
Great.
us.
Welcome, everybody. Let's see here. There's like a delay that's throwing me off a little bit. What self-harm isn't? I want to make it real clear here that having the wish to die could potentially be a form of self-harm, but self-harm often is not actually a wish to die. It's not saying, self-harm isn't saying, I'm actually going to go kill myself. And I'll give you an example here. Kids with autism spectrum disorder oftentimes have this repetitive behavior. They'll bang their heads, they'll hit themselves as a way to express some sort of frustration, or in some cases also to modulate something that's going on in their sensory environment. They hear a sound that's too loud, they don't know how to modulate it, they don't have the words to express what's going on, so they'll engage in these self-harm types of behaviors, but they don't really have any intention of dying. In fact, many of them really do like being around. They just don't know how to modulate that experience that they're having. So it's really different than an actual suicide attempt. The other piece to kind of keep in mind here is that self-harm by itself isn't actually a mental health diagnosis, but it does often happen kind of at the same time. I think my slides might be cut off by this, so how about we put the screen over here? Can everybody see that part now, this little co-occurs piece? Okay, good. The key point here is that even though it may not signal a sign that somebody wants to die, we should probably still take it seriously at all levels, whether you're a parent, an educator, an administrator, another professional, or just even a friend or family member. It is very important to take it as a serious sign. Make sense? Let's see if I can get to the next thing here. Let's talk just about how often this happens. Pretty common, actually. I did the math, and it ends up being about 50, based on our population today, just in the United States. 17% of people equates to about 51 million people over the course of their lifetimes who are alive today will self-harm to some degree. The worrying thing for us mental health folks is that there's actually been a really big increase in the prevalence of self-harm. There are a couple of pieces as to why this is. Partly it's getting reported more often, but partly there's just more people who are engaging in these types of behaviors. So we've really seen about a 50% increase from 2009 to about 2020. Anyone want to take a guess as to why I cut it off at 2020? Don't read ahead, don't cheat. Anyone want to wager a guess why the stats kind of end at 2020?
The Rona.
Yeah, COVID kind of messed a bunch of things up, both in terms of research and obviously in terms of our lives. I was doing a little bit of looking around at what the current research is saying, and we do have a gap. The way researchers are looking at this is kind of early phase COVID and then late phase COVID, which is kind of where we're in now. I'm guessing that the late stage of COVID research is going to show that things are really kind of ticking up in terms of self-harm behavior. The estimates are all over the place right now. I wouldn't put any weight into these numbers that I'm about to give you. What some researchers are saying is somewhere around 50% increase over 2019. Some are saying as much as a 6-fold increase. So the range is pretty broad. We're going to have to wait until the final numbers come back. But the interesting thing is that when we talk about the early phase COVID, so we're talking like March, April, maybe even May of last year, the prevalence of it went down. Anyone want to take a guess why that might be? No wrong answers here. No?
I think it's about reporting.
Can you say a little bit more?
So like you just said it was in the beginning of COVID times, right? March.
Yep.
I mean, a lot of, I think the reports that end up coming out are about youth, primarily high school students. And in many cases nationwide, high school students have not been back to school to be seen by the people that support them for now about a year.
Yeah.
And so I think maybe it's a reporting discrepancy. I mean, if something happens in the household or behind closed doors, then it probably doesn't end up in our graphs.
Yeah, teachers are frontline workers in the same way that ER workers are kind of on the front lines of a lot of things as well. And I think your point is totally spot on. The research that we do have looks at hospital admissions. So this is people reporting to the emergency room, essentially saying, yeah, you know, I have self-harm thoughts, feelings. I have cuts on my arms. Maybe I did something to my body that requires medical attention. Yeah, so they're not going to school and they're also not going to the ER. One of the pieces of speculation is that people were actually avoiding the ER early on because they didn't want to catch COVID. So they just kind of stayed home and hid and didn't really report. So the statistics are really gonna be off for a little bit here. So yes, I think it is a matter of reporting, both in terms of to teachers and educators and also to medical staff in general. A lot of people just kind of crawled into holes about this time last year. I know I did. Other interesting pieces here. The first episode is pretty young. Anybody surprised by that? 13 years old is the average. I see some no's, maybes, kind of some in-betweens. More females than males. For trans folks, people in the gender queer spectrum, the rates are quite a bit higher. I read a stat somewhere along the lines. It wasn't a reliable stat, again, because it didn't have a huge sample size. Black trans teens had something like a 20-fold increase in incidents of self-harm. So there are pockets within our communities that are really, really impacted and really, I think, are struggling in a lot of regards to find some help. And yeah, of course, it tends to happen in adolescents more so than adults. I want to shift the conversation here briefly to one about pain as I do a quick check-in on our time. Anyone seen this scale when they go to the doctor's office? Yep. 0 or 1 is usually like, yeah, I'm hanging out, no problem. I'm on my couch watching TV. 10 is, oh my goodness, this is like the worst pain ever. Let's see, where's my little cheat sheet here? No, not there. I'm going to exit out of my presenter mode because I have some notes here. Yeah, okay, so I want to break down the difference between simple pain and complex pain. How do I get my, anyone know how I can get these two things to exist at the same time again? Ah, there we go. Okay, great. So I'll give you an example of something like hanging out with friends. Where would people generally put something like that on the pain scale? I see a 1, okay. Eating ice cream? 0, okay. I see Shauna's an ice cream fan, yeah. You know, the thing about pain is that it's really subjective, right? I'm giving really softball examples here. I want to ratchet it up a little bit to maybe slightly more difficult situations. I like to give the example of a deep tissue massage. Where would people put a deep tissue massage on this type of a pain scale? Amber says 5. Anyone else want to chime in? 5, 6? If you're on mute, I probably won't see you here because it doesn't pop up on my screen. Anyone want to chime in with what they think a deep tissue massage might be? What about breaking up with somebody? Ooh, tough one, right? Why are these two examples maybe a little bit harder than like sitting on your couch or eating ice cream? Anyone want to chime in? No?
There's an emotional connection as well as a physical connection. So if you're talking
Okay.
about breaking up with somebody, there's so many circumstances that come into that. And so it's
Yeah.
not necessarily a physical pain, as painful as it is, it's different. And with, when you're talking massage, there's a physical pain, but there's also a release and a joy that comes with that. And so you have to balance those, and it's a little different.
Amber, you hit the nail on the head. It's really about the context, right? If you're breaking up with somebody because the relationship just needs to end and you want to move on, your pain actually might be a bit lower than if you're breaking up with somebody for some other reasons. Maybe you don't really want to break up, but you kind of have to. It could be a more painful type of experience. And with the deep tissue massage example, it really depends on what you're going there for. Some people like really light, soothing, relaxing massages. Some people hate massages altogether and like, no, me going into a massage therapist's office, that's a 10. I would never do that. But we have these subjective experiences in our lives about pain, and we all have very different thresholds around it based on the context. And then the interesting part here is that emotional pain really does actually look like physical pain when we actually look at what's going on a neurotransmitter basis. In your brain, when we do functional MRIs, physical pain looks a lot like emotional pain. So much so, in fact, that a lot of researchers are essentially equating the two. Now, you'll get a little bit of nitpicky argument on either side, but I think as a general purpose for our conversation tonight, you can think of them as roughly equivalent. And that the pain that somebody is experiencing in self-harm is usually an expression of some form of isolation. Meaning I don't have a community that I connect with, or the community that I am supposed to connect with is rejecting me. I don't know how to connect to other people. And during COVID, obviously, this is a real challenge, right? Because we're all kind of disconnected by design to some degree. So what I'm really trying to equate here is that self-harm is an expression of pain that depends on the context, much like the other examples that I'm talking about here. For some folks, self-harm is an expression of relief. For some people, self-harm isn't so relieving, and they just get stuck in these modes and really can't break out of it, and it is actually quite excruciating for these folks. Any questions in that analogy? Is that making sense to people, first of all? Yeah, okay, good. Let's shift topics again here to talk about the internet. How do people think that the internet is influencing self-harm? What factors are there?
Social media, for me, it's like thinking about Instagram or Facebook, the amount of likes equate to, it ends up affecting your esteem or your mental state because people are liking or not liking what you're posting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so if you were to draw a connection to self-harm, how would that influence it? Tough one, as my lights go out here. That like cycle is a fascinating one. And I think for a lot of people who engage in self-harm, it can actually be a really complicated thing. Let me distinguish a couple of pieces here, and I'll come back to your point, Shauna. I like to think about the internet and self-harm forces in kind of two categories. The first line here is self-harm how-to groups, and there are self-harm support groups. And there's kind of general internet, which I'll talk about in a minute here. if anybody can do me a favor and just compare these two categories and some of the information I put underneath of them, what do people notice about that? What do people notice about groups that promote self-harm and groups that try to teach folks how to manage their feelings differently?
Matt, you're not screen sharing right now.
Oh, how did that happen?
We don't have your slides.
Well, that's a problem. How about that? Good.
Got it.
Has it been like that for a couple of minutes here?
Yes.
You are all just so polite. I had no idea that I wasn't actually sharing the information. I'm going to have to go back and start the presentation over. Okay. Thank you, Amber, for chiming in. So now that you can actually see my screen, and I know that you can see my screen, does anybody want to compare these two groups?
I mean, I guess I could give it a shot. I mean, they're obviously you're talking about two polar purposes. One of which is coping and is positive, could be very good for an individual, and the other one might put them in a rabbit hole, you know,
Yep.
and go further and further down. I mean, I think they're both incredibly common, and what I see about the internet is that behaviors which one can find in society are taboo, are often not spoken about, and may not be approved with the wide kind of grip of the internet and how many people there are available to interact with. You can find a group of individuals who will support those activities. I mean, it could be anything. Could be taboo things like pedophilia, or like the relationship to eating disorders. You can find eating disorder support groups that actually are pro eating disorder. I mean, but like any kind of niche, even like political groups like Nazism, you know, maybe you can't find it in your town, but you can find it online. And I guess that actually it's harder maybe to sometimes find the support groups that talk you out of such things. If you're looking for it, you know, you'll find the other side as well.
Yeah, that's a really wonderful point. I couldn't see who was making that comment. Do you mind letting me know your name?
Name's Elizabeth.
Elizabeth, thank you for chiming in that regard. And you're absolutely right. You're actually jumping 2 or 3 slides ahead of me on something that I want to cover as well. Your points are absolutely well taken. You know, it's almost as if there are these channels that people fall into. I used to like to give the people example, like, you know, there's a magazine for every interest. And once you pick up that magazine, you find examples of that thing everywhere you look. The same phenomenon kind of happens on the internet, but on a more specific and focused basis. And there are also the algorithms that are trying to hook you and to take your attention so that they can monetize it. The piece that I'm speaking to in this slide here is really how similar the formats are for both groups, right? You're talking about Facebook groups, websites, various forums, all kinds of things. And they, from an overview standpoint, look very, very, very similar. You know, you can look at one website and it can be great. You can look at another website and it can be terrible. The thing to recognize is that both from a research and friend and also community member standpoint, you got to know the specifics. You can't just say, oh, it's Facebook groups, or oh, it's social media, or oh, it's a certain website. You have to be very specific in recognizing that there are pros and cons to pretty much every format. And that the goals of some of them are very similar. Shauna, to your point there, and Elizabeth actually, you know, there's a function about normalizing behavior that happens on the internet. And this is very much similar to the magazine example that I was giving. You find an interest and you can find other people who are going to normalize it, whether it's good, bad, somewhere in the middle, it is out there. So that being said, let me go to the next slide. The specific sources really, really, really matter. We have some pretty good research on internet addiction, some pro-suicide websites. This is shocking, right? If you go to the websites that suggest that self-harm is a good idea, you're probably going to have some higher risk factors. Conversely, if you go to websites that are about living healthy lifestyles and finding alternate ways of dealing with difficult feelings, you're probably going to be less likely to engage in those types of behaviors. So the wonderful thing about this is that a lot of this is actually under our control. You have choice where you point your browser, what apps you go onto, what Facebook groups you join, all of that kind of stuff. You have a lot of choice in that regard. In terms of the general internet, people who spend a ton of time on the internet don't seem to engage in self-harm more often than people who are completely off the internet when adjusted for a bunch of other factors. The other part here is that social media has some association with self-harm, but again, I think you really have to be specific. It's not just Facebook, it's not just Instagram, it's not just Snapchat, it's what are you doing on those different platforms? Let's see here. We're going to talk about video and image sharing platforms because that's kind of the new rage. That's the new, as the kids say these days. Cyberbullying. This is a little bit of an outdated term, but it seems to be the one that people kind of gravitate towards still. Are people familiar with that term, first of all? Yeah, I figured as much. It's essentially teasing or demeaning or trying to harm other people, usually over the internet or some digital service. Cyberbullying is just, it has so many negative effects because it has the typical effects of you hearing something from somebody else that you don't necessarily want to hear, but the internet has this multiplying effect. So it's not just one or two people, it could potentially be millions of people uh, giving you images or making statements to you that are pretty harmful. And I was actually shocked that there's a recent study just last year that came out that 20 to 44% of adolescents in the US report cyberbullying. Are people familiar with memes? This is a particularly interesting part of internet culture, isn't it? Because sometimes they're pretty funny. There's a part about Peter Griffin from what's the name of that show? Family Guy. Yeah, Family Guy. Thank you, Morgan. Literally getting glued to the couch because COVID has just been going on for so long, right? This one's pretty funny to me. Wait, your real name isn't Mom? What do you mean? And I'm not sure who this gentleman here is at the bottom, but he seems to be kind of an internet celebrity, and pretty much every type of meme has been put over his image. The interesting thing about memes is that they operate on two levels at the same time, oftentimes humorous and somewhat sarcastic. It's a very difficult psychological place to be in to decode the meaning of some memes, and it's really easy to miss the true dark side to some of these memes. For instance, let's see, is this going to go to the next page for me? No, let's do it this way. There we go. I'm going to move this here, if it'll let me. One of the emerging cultures within memes and within the internet is to speak to the fact that people appear one way on the outside, but feel very differently on the inside. Again, it's a difficult message to decode because you don't know what you're supposed to respond to as an outside viewer. Am I supposed to respond to the happy face? Am I supposed to respond to the tears and red eye behind it? And it's easy to kind of dismiss the true message of what's being said by this. These types of things are really proliferating across social media, across the Discord and some of the other forums online. And it's a safe way that somebody is essentially trying to say, I'm hurting, but I don't really want to take accountability, or I don't really want people to understand how much I'm truly hurting because there's a smiley face, for instance. It operates on two levels and for most people gets pretty confusing. Can I get some reactions to this little kind of new wrinkle that we've seen emerge in the past couple of years? Is this surprising to anybody, first of all? Amber, I see you saying no. Anybody I haven't heard from yet have a reaction to any of this so far? Nope. Okay, fair enough. I will move on. I'm going to recommend a pretty interesting book. If you are interested in internet culture and specifically the history of memes, oh, like little Pepe is hiding right there. If you don't know who Pepe the Frog is, this is a wonderful resource for you to learn about the cultural significance behind it. I'm going to sidestep the conversation of politics of this particular book, and in all honesty, politics is a pretty small portion of the book. The part that I think is so fascinating about Dale Brennan's book is that it is, I think, the most thorough accounting of how meme culture came to influence what a lot of folks who engage in self-harm have found on the internet. First of all, are people familiar with Pepe the Frog? Yeah. Show of hands here. Anybody not familiar with Pepe? If I can actually see everybody, I'm going to do it this way. Nan, okay, I can see you there, Nan. I see Lisa's shining face. Oh, wait, that's not an actual live picture. Okay, great. Anyhow, oops. The interesting part about it, again, is that in understanding where self-harm culture is going, I think we really do need to take a deeper dive into memes because they operate on that dual level for many folks of saying, I'm hurting, but don't pay attention to the fact that I'm hurting. I think we as community members need to know that this is a common way that people are expressing they feel isolated from people around them. They want the laughs, they want the likes, they want the comment about the sarcasm, but I think what they're also expressing is that oftentimes they're in pain and that we need to think about it again, going back to that conversation I was having earlier about that pain. Okay, I'm going to shift topics here again to help. Before I do, I want to open the floor. Does anybody have any questions? Do I need to go back and clarify anything about what I've talked about so far?
I have a quick question. When you were talking about cyberbullying,
Yeah.
how do those statistics relate to, what we as some of us as the older generation see as traditional bullying? Like, do we have any comparison of how that has maybe escalated?
Cyberbullying is probably I don't know the actual numbers. I didn't look that part up. It's a really good question. Cyberbullying is absolutely the predominant form of bullying. It takes what used to happen on the schoolyard, after school, in small hangout groups, and adds the magnifying effect of social media. So it certainly is more prevalent at this point. I can say anecdotally from the kids, teens, and young adults that I deal with, it really is probably the primary way that most people experience cyberbullying. And that's also not to diminish the fact that people also experience just regular bullying, the old-fashioned bullying in their places of work, sometimes in small group settings, in the classroom, and unfortunately, sometimes within their family. So, Amber, I can't exactly say what the statistic is comparing the two, but I do think that the primary mode of that type of harmful behavior happens over the internet these days. Does that answer that question?
Yes, that definitely helps. I was just
Okay.
curious if there was some quantitative, information out there about how much worse it has gotten.
I can dig it up. One of my good friends wrote his dissertation on cyberbullying, so I could do.
Mhm.
If you email me, Amber, I can get you an answer to
Okay.
that pretty quickly. So.
Yeah, I'm curious because I understand that it's worse from talking to, the kids and the young people in my life. I just didn't know what research had been done to surround it.
Gotcha. Yep, I can dig that up for you. I would say it's a safe assumption that most kids who are experiencing bullying are probably experiencing cyberbullying. Yeah. Any other questions?
I kind of have a
Commentary?
next level question for you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Um, how do you feel all of this relates to disembodiment? Do you feel that like the increased internet presence and all of that causes greater disembodiment? How is embodiment and disembodiment associated with self-harm?
Can you clarify a little bit about what you mean by embodiment or disembodiment?
Okay, yeah. So so there's a concept that people have multiple parts of themselves, their minds, their bodies, maybe their spirituality, etc. And then trauma causes people to disintegrate pieces of themselves and see them as perhaps alien parts. You know, like, for example, like, I reside in my head, I am, you know, mentally, I'm a person, but like, this body is not mine. That would be a disembodied way of thinking about one's relationship to pieces that are in theory all themselves. Does that make sense?
Yep. I think the closest research that I can talk about is around identity. We have a wide variety of identities that are salient to us, depending on the context. Sometimes the physical body that you're in is the most salient identity that you have in that moment. You know, let's say I'll give a real benign example here, not to minimize, but just as an example. You're going to try on some clothing, right? You're looking in the mirror, your identity is in some way formed by the fact that you're engaged in a behavior that relates to your physical body. The internet, by contrast, is almost the exact opposite. Like, it's a totally bizarre concept in the history of human development. The fact that we are having this conversation right now and none of you are in the same room as me. So we are all little disembodied avatars on our screens at this point. That wouldn't exist without the internet. So to your point, the internet absolutely facilitates a disembodiment on a wide number of fronts, some adaptive, some completely unadaptive. And I would say that, you know, you can go to the internet and present yourself in any particular way that is either related to a particular or previously existing identity or completely separated from it. You know, folks on dating websites experience this difficulty a lot, because how do you know the person that you're chatting with on a dating website is who they say they are, or by contrast is presenting a particular image of themselves that you can't necessarily trust? So, you know, the internet tugs at these concepts of what it means to be a human being, what it means to have particular identities, and absolutely what it means to be in a physical body. As that pertains to self-harm, you know, that would be an interesting conversation. I'm not aware of any research that looks specifically at that, but in essence, you know, the isolation that people feel is certainly fueled by, you know, internet use. That's a real common thing, especially social media. And I would argue that, you know, you're probably in pretty good standing by saying that the internet helps to disembody in a way that is not particularly helpful for many people, especially people who are already prone to feeling isolated, alone, maybe have difficulty connecting with other people, or who have experienced trauma. So, Elizabeth, that was a real long-winded answer to your question. Does that kind of address the core concept of what you're trying to get at?
No, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, of course. Any other questions? Oh, I can see Kelsey. Hey, Kelsey. Anybody else have any questions? No. Okay. Let's talk about help. Am I correct in saying I got 15 minutes to get through this? Yep. Okay, great. I am going to give, this is widely available. So these are resources that if you yourself are self-harming, or you know somebody who's self-harming, you can point them to. This is literally from the Mayo Clinic. These are some things that you can do, some self-care remedies at home that you can do to encourage people to shift some of the problematic self-harming behavior towards more adaptive things without pretending to be a therapist or even feeling like you need to be a therapist to the person in your life, because that's, you know, a bit of a different role. You know, the goal essentially is to shift a person from a place of feeling isolated and stuck to helping them feel as though there are people who are willing to listen and who can probably help. There's a link to a website here. If anyone's interested in the slides from this presentation, I'm more than happy to give it out. But they're doing the basics, you know, take care of yourself, try to get good night's sleeps, try to get some exercise, try to talk to people who care about you, know what the things are that really set you off, and try to avoid them. And if you can't, there are resources out there that can really help. Let's see, I thought I had the website in there somewhere. Oh, I must have deleted that. If anyone is interested in the link to this, I can give it, but it is on the Mayo Clinic. More specifically, though, I was anticipating I was going to be talking to some parents tonight, in addition to some educators. So I want to give some specific points to parents. Uh, I tend to break things down into three phases. There's the prevention, there's the preparedness, and then there's what to do when those two things have failed. What I would suggest in sort of the prevention realm is it's really important as parents to understand what children and adolescents and sometimes young adults are really doing on the internet. It's less important to look at the number of hours somebody is spending behind the screen as it is to look at what they're actually doing on the screen. My strong recommendation is at least consider limiting access to social media until 16. And if you got a middle schooler, please, please, please don't let them get on social networks. It's just not good, especially for girls. The research on that is super consistent. Anybody have any ideas about why middle school in particular is not a great time for social media? Did anyone have a hard time in middle school?
I mean, that's
Pretty
when
awkward.
people are forming their identities and figuring out who they are. I definitely was not the most popular kid in high school, so I know what it's like to be on the fun end of all of that.
Middle school is a very difficult time of transition. Going back to that top line stat of 13 years old being kind of the first time that people engage in self-harm, middle school's tough. Kids can be really mean in middle school because they are forming their identities, and sometimes people take on the identity of being a bully because it's what they can do. There is an asymmetry in how boys and girls develop around this time too. Girls become much more socially adept than boys, and I think one of the ways that that expresses itself for young girls is essentially that there's a lot of interpersonal aggression, as opposed to for boys, there's actually more like physical aggression. I think this is probably one of the primary explanations for why girls in this age bracket are more primed to engage in self-harm, and also just in general middle school being one of the prime times for girls to engage in it. Social media in particular has that amplifying effect. And if you have one person who's bullying you in the classroom, can you imagine what it would be like to have a whole host of other girls or maybe even boys or whoever bullying you through social media and just sending you constant messages? Ugh, that is a brutal thing to manage. The other part of it too is that middle schoolers are really, really adept at technology by that point and are often farther ahead in terms of the latest and greatest tech platforms than their parents are hip to it. So there's again that kind of asymmetry between what kids are into and how parents are understanding what's actually going on in their life. The key point is if you have a kid, ask them, do they feel connected to others? Do they feel lonely? Do they feel like they have people that they can turn to, not named mom or dad, right? Do they have friends? One of the assessment measures I used to give pre-COVID was, how many birthday parties has your kid been invited to in the last year? If the answer is zero, we need to get that kid socially hooked up, basically. And the other question that parents really need to be asking their kids is, are you being made fun of? Are there other kids who you feel are making fun of you? And if the answer is yeah, you got to shift the dynamic for them. You got to shift them towards more adaptive, healthier social groupings. Does that does that make sense to everybody? The other key point in terms of prevention, this is consistent research for probably over 50 years of social psychology and social science in general. Having a healthy, supportive, encouraging, positive relationship that includes open communication with your kid is the most protective thing in their life for a number of things. As I let Kelsey back in. Welcome back, Kelsey. Uh, Open door policies where the expectation is that a kid is supposed to just come into your door and bring something to your attention isn't enough. It doesn't work just to say to your kid, well, you can talk to me anytime. Because the honest truth is that many kids don't know how to talk about these issues. These need to be parent-led conversations because your adult brain has words that even 17-year-olds don't have access to the same way. Parents really need to be leading the charge in these conversations with their kids. It's not just waiting for them to come to you, but you going to your kids and saying, hey, let's check in. Let's make sure things are going well for you. How do you feel about your peer groups and conversations like that? In the any questions about that, first of all? In the training and preparedness sections, there are some wonderful programs out there. NAMI has some training programs. There's a thing called mental health first aid, just like the American Red Cross has physical health first aid. You know, you learn how to bandage and do CPR and things like that. Mental health first aid gives some very similar, in concept at least, tools to your average person to deal with somebody who is actually having a hard time. This is also where I'm going to plug the Suicide Prevention Network and open the floor to Lisa or Morgan here to give any updates about things that you folks have going on in that front. Do you have any trainings, any community things other than this workshop going on that folks should know about?
We don't have, we have the trainings through the college that are coming up. There's some more following you. Thank you so much. And then we usually do Safe Talk training, which is a 4-hour training about basically how to recognize signs and what to say and what to do next, including helping someone get a safety plan. That's about 4 hours. And then we, maybe like once a year, we collaborate and offer a training called Assist, which is actually a 2-day training, but it is amazing. That's one of the best trainings I've been to, and I've been to a lot of trainings in my career. That takes it even farther, you know, down to, you do a lot of role playing where you would even know what to say to literally talk someone off the ledge. So Safe Talk training and Assist, and you can go to our website or you can look those up. And you can always reach out to us. We usually schedule Safe Talks like by demand, and we can do them for all different kinds of agencies. We don't offer mental health first aid, but I just want to plug that. I've also taken that too, and that was really great. And it just covers such a wide variety of mental health topics. But if anyone in here wanted us to do a training, even a tailored training for any agency or group, we do that. Thank you.
I also want to add a little bit too with the mental health first aid. There are 2 different ones. There's an adult mental health first aid training, and there's also a mental health first aid training for youth. So there's 2 different ones, not necessarily meaning that the youth mental health training is for kids to go to, but it's more to learn about the mental health mindset of a kid and how to deal with a kid coming off of trauma rather than dealing with adult, because you interact with adults and kids very differently. So those trainings are awesome.
Matt, Nan speaking here. I'm a grandparent trying to raise my grandchildren, and they've all been traumatized by domestic violence. And we have found, my husband and I have found an awful lot of support and ideas and explanations and comfort and so on from the foster family group that is right on our campus. They have bi-monthly programs. They work with NAMI, and I think that they have not only have speakers, but what is really helpful is the group of parents who get together, and usually they are people who are taking care of relatives or children who have, through loss, been traumatized and are not with anyone they know. And here are adults who are trying very hard to be supportive and don't have anyone to turn to themselves. And so these adult working groups were enlightening, comforting, and I think especially due to our age, they brought the therapy and the family help and so on that has just multiplied over the last, say, 30 years forward to those of us who didn't have a clue. I mean, when we raised our children, it was so different, and it was pre-cell phone. I mean, if you can imagine that, it was pre-computer, it was pre-internet. We went camping, and now, you know, our grandchildren are just in a different world, and it's very hard for us to integrate into that world, and it's hard for us to deal with them. You said, oh, you know, don't wait for the child to come to you. You go to the child. Well, you cannot do that. I mean, maybe you have a way in, but as a grandparent or as a caregiver of a traumatized person, your attempts to embrace merely push them away. They are lacking in trust, and they cannot trust you, especially because you're trying to take the place of someone who left them.
Yep.
In one way or another, death or incarceration or illness. The child blames their parent, and then they blame you for trying to replace their parent. And it's a whole new world. It's not just raising children the same way you raised your own children. So you were trying to mention support groups, and these people are right on our campus and throughout our town.
It is lovely to hear that there are resources in a way that there weren't 30 years ago. I haven't been in this town for 30 years. I've only been here for about 10 now. So I don't have quite that same perspective that you do. And it's lovely. You know, I wish that there were probably, 30 times more today than exist. And I think the need is probably there as well. And Nan, to your point there, yeah, there are so many factors that go into these situations. And again, I'm providing kind of the general overview of situations like this. Support groups are wonderful because they can get into specifics, and hearing things that are both similar to and different than your experience really helps people feel connected. And again, so many of these issues around self-harm relate to connection, not just for the person engaging in self-harm, but for families, friends, community members. It really has a ripple effect in so many different lives. So Nan, I'm really glad to hear that you found that support, and I hope that other folks on the call or who are watching this later on hear how it's helped you really kind of understand and find some support. So thank you for sharing that story.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Okay, so we have just a few minutes here. I'm going to give just some real basic things that you should do and things that you shouldn't do. If you find somebody who is having either a current or past episode of self-harm, it can be very shocking to discover this. You may see cuts, you may see blood, you might see stitches. It can really raise feelings in us. Try to keep a level head about it to the best of your ability. Don't shame them, don't interrogate them, don't pity them, don't make jokes or make light. Don't say things like, well, there's really a silver lining to the situation, and certainly don't talk about how it affects others. Instead, listen to what they're saying. Rephrase what they're saying to you. Make sure that you're understanding them accurately. Try to stay as emotionally neutral as you can. Don't get too high, don't get too low, don't get too ramped up, don't check out completely, and really try to show compassion. You can turn them to supports, you can turn them to groups, you can turn them to NAMI, you can turn them to the Suicide Prevention Network, you can turn them to all kinds of various helps in our community. And I'm so glad that we do have some resources around us. So I am out of time. Let's see here. I think I was going to go to Q&A next. Does anybody have any questions about stuff I've covered? Not so much. Everybody ready for dinner? Well, I said I had a surprise, so I'm going to leave you with a quiz. Whether you get to it or not is completely up to you. For the folks watching at home later on, you can take this quiz. The answers are in the slides previously. If anyone wants to talk about bonus question number 1, I didn't specifically talk about this piece here, but I thought if we had extra time, it might be an interesting discussion piece, but I want to be respectful of everybody's time and zip my lips here.